Greetings and salutations and welcome to a video about audio. In this video I would like to talk about setting the proper vertical tracking force for your turntable. There are a lot of myths and misconceptions out there about tracking force, and unfortunately a lot of misinformation on the web. Just the other day I watched a YouTube video in which a fellow told his viewers that the proper way to set tracking force was to add just enough until the needle would track the record without skipping. I'm afraid there's a little bit more to it than that. Another common misconception is that you need to track very light to minimize the wear on your records and make your stylus last as long as possible. Well, the actual truth is that if you track too light, you can cause extra damage to your records and shorten the life of your stylus. So it's not about tracking light, it's about tracking right. And that's what we're going to talk about in this video. First of all, let's talk about the anatomy of a phono cartridge, because you need to understand what's going on when you put the needle on the record. It's that little box at the end of the tone arm, and you drop that on the record and the little stylus tracks the groove. The stylus is vibrated by the little jiggles in the groove and the little wiggles, and those vibrations go up the cantilever, some people call that a needle, through the suspension and to a magnet. And when it gets to the magnet, that magnet moves along with those little jiggles in the groove, and it creates little tiny impulses of electricity in a coil. Those impulses of electricity are sent on to your amplifier. They're equalized and amplified to the point where they will make speakers work, and they produce sound, and that's the sound that you hear. Making a record is the exact reverse process. You send sound into a coil, which moves a magnet, which moves a cantilever, which causes a stylus to dig a groove in a record and make a permanent record of the vibrations of the sound. You've heard of moving coil cartridges. Well, that just means that the coil is connected to the cantilever and the magnet stays still. Styli come in two flavors. You have bonded and nude. A bonded stylus means that there is a little piece of metal that is actually attached to the end of the cantilever called a shank. And on one end of that is the stylus, which is a chip of diamond cut to a specific shape, which is cemented to one end of the shank while the other is connected to the cantilever. A nude stylus means that the diamond is actually large enough to be attached directly to the cantilever. They sound a little bit better because there's, fewer physical connections, but they do tend to be a lot more expensive because it's a bigger chunk of diamond. So the part of the cartridge that determines what tracking force you use is the suspension and the cantilever. And how easily the suspension will allow the cantilever to move and how stiff the cantilever is all goes together to form a property called compliance in a cartridge. A high compliance cartridge means that that cantilever is very free to move in the groove and it responds very easily to the vibrations. A low compliance cartridge has a stiffer cantilever and a tighter suspension, and they're useful when you have a high mass, kind of heavy tone arm, or maybe you are working in a situation where you're going to be back cueing, scratching like DJs. They tend to like low compliance cartridges. Another way to think of a high compliance versus a low compliance cartridge is to imagine a car. A low compliance cartridge would be like a car that had a very stiff suspension, very tight springs. And if you didn't have a whole lot of weight in the car, when you drove down the road and went over bumps, it would be very unpleasant because the springs would not absorb the shock. And you would need to weight the car down to get that to work. If you didn't have enough weight in the car, you might even run into a situation where you hit a bump and you'd go flying over that bump and then land in the road, and it would be a big jolt because the springs were not compliant enough to absorb the shock and let you roll over it. A high compliance cartridge is just the reverse. Think of a car with really soft springs, and you can ride down the road. The road can be very bumpy, but you can't really feel the bumps in the road. But the problem with that car is that if you put too much weight into it, then the bottom of the car is going to start dragging the road, the springs are going to bottom out, and it's going to be a very unpleasant situation. Same thing happens with cartridges. So the main reason that we have this whole cantilever suspension setup is to make sure that the stylus stays in contact with the groove walls. That suspension and the cantilever absorbs all the bumps and the jolts that goes across the surface of a record, because there's very few records out there that are actually completely flat. Most records have a little bit of warp. Some of them have bumps in them. Or you could bump the turntable or walk by. You never know. The idea is to absorb that vibration and keep that stylus in the groove. And if it's not doing its job properly because it doesn't have enough force applied to it or too little, it causes problems. So let's talk a little bit about stylus shape and maximum tracking force. There's a lot of information on this slide. We're going to start up here at the upper left-hand corner, and you see that we have a chart that shows some different stylus shapes. We have conical, elliptical, and on our chart here it says line contact and microline, which means it came to us from Audio-Technica. Microline is a brand name of an advanced stylus shape that Audio-Technica sells. We're mainly going to be concerned with conical and elliptical styli. Anything other than that is considered to be an advanced shape, and there's many of them. They're called hyperelliptical, vivid line, Vandenhall, Shibata, and they usually come on very expensive cartridges, and they require very careful setup. But when we're talking about good old conical and elliptical styli, there's actually quite a bit of range to work with. The maximum is determined simply by the stylus shape and the size of that stylus. The first conical on the list there is a 0.7 mil, which is 1/1000th of an inch, and it tracks at 4 grams. And yes, we are mixing the old imperial system and the metric system, and that is because years ago, even before we measured stylus force in grams, we were measuring the width of a stylus in mils and grooves. Many years ago, stylus force was measured in ounces. It's only been measured in grams for about the past 70 years or so. So a 0.7 mil conical is a kind of stylus that is recommended for playing stereo records. That was the original type of stylus that was recommended. Before that, microgroove records, 45s and LPs in mono, were played with a 1 mil stylus. They reduced the size of the 0.7 mil stylus just a little bit because a stereo groove has more wandering around, let's put it that way, and the grooves tend to be a little bit thinner on than the bigger, older mono grooves were. To understand the difference between a conical stylus and an elliptical stylus, look over to your right here. A conical stylus is also known as a spherical stylus because when you look at it head on, it looks like a ball. Technically speaking, a spherical stylus may have trouble tracking certain grooves on the record, especially if the squiggles in the groove turn the corners too fast. So the idea behind an elliptical stylus is that it's sort of shaped like an American football, and it presents its squeezed in parts to the front and back so it can go around corners better. Now, the truth of the matter is that a mild elliptical and a highly polished spherical stylus may or may not sound the same. It depends on the condition of the record. It depends on how much wear is already in the grooves. It depends on how well the tone arm is set up. It depends on the alignment. There's a lot that goes into that. But a 0.3 by 0.7 mil elliptical, generally speaking, is going to be a little bit more detailed than most spherical styli. I kind of like the sound of a conical or spherical stylus. They tend to work better over a variety of records, whereas elliptical styli really excel on very clean records. But let's not get too far off into that. Now, the original spec for stereo records in 1957 was that you would have that 0.7 mil stylus tracking at 6 grams because back in the days of mono LPs and 45s, between 4 and 6 grams was pretty much the standard as far as tracking force was concerned. And that's an awful lot. And you can still find those records these days. And as long as those styli were replaced and the records were kept clean, there's not a whole lot of wear in the groove. But when we went to stereo and the conical styluses got smaller, they had to reduce that a little bit. So now the upper limit pretty much is 4 grams for safely tracking a stereo record. Now that doesn't mean that every cartridge on the planet, especially some of the ceramic cartridges out there, limits itself to 4 grams, but the better ones do. Back in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, companies like Tetrad, RCA, Sonotone, they made ceramic cartridges that tracked very happily at 3.5 or 4 grams. And a lot of BSR and Garrard turntables were shipped with those cartridges and have played a lot of the records that you are now picking up in the used record shop, and most of them are just fine. However, there have always been, and I guess there always will be, people out there who think it's okay to run at 6 grams and higher, and those sorts of ceramic cartridges can definitely damage a record. When you talk about a 0.6 mil conical, which is just a little bit smaller and very popular these days, most of the conical styli out there are 0.6 mil now. They tend to have a little bit of an advantage in that when you play a record that has been abused by a 0.7 mil elliptical or conical stylus in the past, and there's a little bit of wear in the record, the 0.6 mil will track under that. But because the conical tip is a little smaller, the contact area is a bit smaller, then we have to reduce that maximum safe tracking force to 3.5 grams. Then we get into mild elliptical. A mild elliptical would be considered a 0.4 by 0.7 mil stylus, and you can safely track one of those up to 3 grams. As a matter of fact, Stanton had a cartridge that was very popular in the 70s and 80s in radio stations. It was the 680EL, and it had a 3 gram recommended tracking force. And boy, I'm going to tell you, I played I don't know how many hours worth of records on those cartridges and never had any wear come out of it. Now, when you get down to a more traditional elliptical, 0.3, 0.7, by 0.7, then you are talking about probably having a safe recommended tracking force of around 2.5 grams. Most 0.3 by 0.7 ellipticals I've ever seen have a recommended tracking force of around 2 grams, and that's perfectly all right. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that if you accidentally track your records at 2.6 grams with a 0.3 by 0.7 elliptical that, automatically it's going to start digging the vinyl out of the grooves. No, a lot of things play into that. How well the cartridge is aligned, the mass of the arm, how well the cartridge is mated to the tone arm, those sorts of things, and the condition of the records all affect how quickly they will wear. But if you stay below these numbers and you maintain your styli by making sure that they're clean, that they're not damaged, and that you replace them when they become worn, your record collection will last forever. The best thing when setting up a cartridge and looking at the tracking force is simply to read the documentation. Most cartridges these days come with a little sheet that tells you exactly what tracking force is recommended, and that is your starting point. They also will give a range. So, for instance, it may say that your cartridge can safely track between 1.5 and 2.5 grams, but the recommended tracking force is 2 grams. 2 grams is usually the place to start. I would not drop below 2 grams unless you are really adept at using your ears to hear the kind of mistracking that indicates that the cartridge is having a problem tracking the groove. That would be lots of sibilance or a buzzing sound. You can after a while you get to know what that is, and you can set tracking force by ear. Some of the older cartridges just gave you a range. It would say like 2 grams to 5 grams, and you would just start ramping it up and listening to that, get a high modulation record, and when you stopped hearing the sibilance, that's where you would know that you were tracking properly. Usually those cartridges, they would track somewhere about 3 to 4 grams, and we're talking about spherical styli from the past. Most modern cartridges, they give you a pretty specific number, so that's just something to keep in mind. One more thing to say about that is that when you're dealing with moving magnet cartridges, the styli are replaceable. Moving coil cartridges, usually they are not. You have to send the whole cartridge in and get it retipped when the stylus wears out. But in a moving magnet cartridge, the proper tracking force is determined by the stylus That's where the suspension is. It's not in the cartridge itself. So when you buy your stylus, your replacement stylus, make sure you know where that's supposed to track. So let's talk a little bit about getting it right. First and foremost, read the documentation. Don't guess. You don't know unless you read. Pretty much every turntable out there that has adjustable tracking force on the tone arm and comes with a cartridge will tell you what tracking force to set that to. Track at or above the recommended tracking force. Avoid trying to track lower. I mean, I know I've run into people all the time in forums that go, well, the recommended tracking force was 2.8, but I'm getting away with tracking it at 1.4. And I'm thinking to myself, okay, you're deaf or you have a really good tone arm. One of the two, I'm not quite sure. More is always better than less. If you are a little bit over the recommended tracking force, this is a good thing. Sometimes, even when everything's just right, you need to tweak it up a little bit. You can do the recommended tracking force, and then you find that you're still hearing a little bit of sibilance, a little bit of distortion. Feel free to add a 1/4 gram, even a 1/2 gram, and see if that goes away, and run it that way for a while until the suspension loosens up. Once again, tracking below recommended tracking force can lead to mistracking, and that adds distortion to the sound and damages your records. And a big thing here is that if you have read the documentation and you find yourself still hearing distortion and you are outside the top of the recommended range, let's say that the top end of your cartridge is 2.5 grams and you're sitting at 2.5 and you are still hearing a lot of distortion and sibilance, that means that there's something wrong. First thing to check would be the alignment of your cartridge, and if that's the way it should be in the tone arm, we're not going to get into alignment in this video. It's out of the scope of the video. But if that's proper and you're still hearing that, that means that there might be something wrong with that cartridge. You might need to send it back. So, when you talk about setting up a lot of turntables, or if you're going to be switching cartridges a lot, you really need to get the proper tools. And the main tool that you need to have, other than a set of jeweler's screwdrivers, which are imperative, and some tweezers, is a very nice stylus gauge. And what these do is they measure the tracking force directly, digitally, and they're relatively cheap. You can get them for as little as $20. Some companies rebadge them and put ungodly prices. If you see one of these out there for $50, $60, $70, don't pay that, because it's just exactly the same thing with a different name on it. That you can buy a generic one, and they will tell you exactly what the tracking force is as long as you get that stylus on that little dot down there. Now, a couple of things to keep in mind about these gauges is that they really need to be set where they are in the same plane that the record surface would ordinarily be. You will get misleading readings if you just set this thing on top of a record, because the stylus doesn't track there. If the arm is like up in the air or way down low, it's not where the tracking force is on the record itself. So what you might need to do is take the mat off and then set that down. Sometimes you need to take the platter off the turntable, and you need to find some other way to prop that up to get that where it's at the right plane. That will give you the correct reading. Another thing is, don't keep the batteries in these things. The off button really doesn't turn it off. It just turns off the display. So what happens is you leave the batteries in, you use it, you set it up. You don't need it for 6 months. You come back and it's dead. So there you go. For those of you who don't know, using the tone arm float method means that you use the counterweight on your tone arm to find the point at which the tone arm floats horizontally to the plinth on the turntable. That is set for 0 with the little dial on the front of the counterweight, and then you move the entire counterweight to dial in the tracking force. That actually works okay most of the time. It depends on the arm. Make sure that it is level. Make sure that you play with it. If you put the needle down and you find out that it's sounding a little funky, like maybe it's under tracking a little bit, you might want to do it twice. And of course, it's always okay to add a little bit more, see if that goes away. That's okay most of the time, but if you really want to get accurate about it, or if you're going to buy very expensive carts that are very finicky about having an exact tracking force and there's not a wide range, you're definitely going to want to get a stylus tracking force gauge. So when do you need to replace the stylus? This is a question that I used to get a lot. Diamond Styli, which is the only thing that you should ever play your records with. Believe it or not, gang, there are still a few cartridges out there that have these horrible sapphire styluses on them. And they're really those cheap ceramic cartridges that track 6 to 9 grams anyway. You don't want to use those. Diamond is the only thing that will play records and hold its shape long enough not to damage them. And they're good for between 500 and 1,000 hours of operation. You should inspect your stylus often for obvious damage. And if you got a microscope, that makes it even better, because then you can look at the tip of the stylus and make sure that it hasn't become damaged or it has little dimples worn into the sides. That is an indication that it is time to change that stylus. It's a good practice to replace your stylus once a year. Most people, maybe you listen to 1 or 2 records a day. After about a year, that's going to add up to about, I don't know, that's going to be 500-600 hours right there. So that would be a good time to change the stylus. And don't forget, too, that the suspension, which is usually part of the stylus assembly, wears as well. It's not just the stylus tip, so you might want to do that. It is possible to chip a diamond stylus, so be very careful with it. I had a friend of mine who has some very rare records in his collection have a stylus get chipped, and he was actually playing a record one day and looked at it, and he could see that the stylus was essentially cutting a new groove. It was damaging the record, and it was an expensive cartridge as well, so it can happen. So be careful with those. Rough handling and playing dirty records is going to accelerate the wear of your stylus. Don't play a dirty record. Make sure that you at least take a damp cloth and wipe it off. And I'm not talking about a little bit of fuzz on records. They all pick that up with static. I'm talking about records that are dirty. They have fingerprints and dust on them. Dust has a lot of silica in it, which is little grains of sand, it's like glass. And as the stylus goes by, it will grind those into the groove walls, destroying the record and shortening the life of the stylus. So clean your records. Make sure that you are cleaning them, because believe me, it's worth the time and effort. And there's lots of different ways to do it. Any way that is better than cleaning a dirty. It's any way you clean it is better than playing a dirty record. And of course, it's important to keep in mind that if you have a worn or damaged stylus, it's going to permanently damage your record. And if you hear a lot of distortion, everything is sounding fine, and then all of a sudden you kind of notice that you're hearing more sibilance, you're hearing that or whatever, that's usually an indication that something is wrong with the stylus or it needs to be replaced. You may need to just clean the stylus, and there's several different ways to do that. Brush it off, dip it in a Q-tip, something like that, or use the magic eraser method, which is what I like the best. That may restore the quality of sound because it might be just dirty. But if it proves to be worn, then go ahead and change it. The main rule of thumb here is that if you think that your stylus is dubious in any way, go ahead and replace it. I always try and have a replacement sitting around just in case I accidentally break it, and then I don't want to have to wait a week. I have to order one and wait for it to come in, and I can't play any records. But yeah, don't be afraid to replace your stylus if you think something's wrong with it. Better safe than sorry. Before we wrap up the video here, I want to talk about choosing a good, cheap turntable. This is addressing some other myths that I have come across on the web. Now, any turntable that you buy that looks like it's in a suitcase most likely has a very crappy ceramic cartridge on it that is tracking at 6 to 9 grams. They will damage your records. Maybe not the first time you play them, but over time they will. And it's really kind of silly to buy one of those cheap little turntables, and records these days are selling, what are they, $25 a piece? That's a lot of money to put into an album that if you play 3 or 4 times on one of those kind of record players, that it'll tear it up. And I'm not mentioning any names, but you know what they look like. Now, these turntables are some of the lowest priced turntables on the market. We're talking about the Audio-Technica LP60 and the Pioneer PL990. Now, they feature an integrated AT3600 cartridge in the tone arm. It tracks at 3.5 grams. The stylus that comes in these cartridges that's what it needs to track. They will not damage your records. You can play records over and over again on these turntables, and it will not hurt them. These tone arms are actually very well balanced. They have anti-skate. They use springs to determine the proper tracking force and the anti-skate. So if you're going to be real slick and measure them, then you need to make sure that you have a stylus gauge that is at the plane of the surface of the record. Because if you have the actual cartridge, tilted way back, you're going to get a very high reading. People say, well, these things track at 4.3 grams. No, they don't. You read it wrong. Make sure that you have it at the proper plane. I have had several of these turntables through the years. Most recently, I bought a Pioneer PL990, and it was a lot of fun. And they actually sound really good, especially on used records. They feature a 0.6 mil conical stylus on them. It tracks beautifully on new and used records, and things are cheap. You can get them for around $100 if you look for a sale, and they're a lot of fun too. So these are the quote-unquote cheap turntables that I would recommend. I certainly hope this video helped you out, and in case you're wondering where I'm getting all my information, I'm going to share a couple of books with you that are really good if you want to learn more about records, and most of them are quite old. This book here was published in 1957 originally. It's called From Tinfoil to Stereo, The Evolution of the Phonograph, written by Oliver Reed and Walter L. Welch. And it is still relevant today simply because of the fact that not a lot has changed when it comes to stereo LPs from 1957 to now. They're still made pretty much the same way and cut pretty much the same way and played back the same way as well. This book is very verbose, and it has a very detailed and in-depth history of the phonograph, starting with the day Edison shouted "Mary Had a Little Lamb" into the first tinfoil phonograph, all the way up until stereo. A lot of details in here about jukeboxes, probably the most in-depth look at the acoustic era when Caruso was the greatest singer out there. If you're really into this subject, find this book. And if you can, find a later issue of it. There's some additional information that was added about record wear and stylus shape, and some technical papers that were put in the appendix later on that are really good. There are several different cover art editions of this, so go by the title and artist. Any version of this you get is going to be pretty good. Another great little booklet is a collection of articles from the 60s, 70s, and 80s from different magazines. It's called The LP is Back. It's by various authors, and there are 35 articles in here, including probably the best article I have ever read describing how phono equalization works, the RIAA curve. Also, there is a very in-depth article in here about stylus tracking force and tracking shapes, stylus shape, and how it all is affected, and they have all kinds of charts and crazy stuff, and it's a lot of fun. You might want to check this out. And it's called The LP is Back by various authors. And the last book we're going to talk about is a really old book from the mid-50s called The Saturday Review Home Book of Recorded Music and Sound Reproduction, and it's edited by Irving Culloden, with several people contributing to the book. Saturday Review was a magazine that talked a lot about records and audio equipment back in the 50s. And this, believe it or not, still has a lot of pertinent information. If you're curious about the history of records, and especially the beginning days of the golden age of hi-fi, which was the 1950s, this is definitely the book to read. They have specific articles in here about equipment that was popular at the time, and they have just some really interesting things to read here, plus a list of early classical LPs at the end. There's a whole list there, so if you're into that, there's just a very interesting old book, and it's quoted a lot these days. Honestly, not a whole lot about records and recording them has changed in the last 50 or 60 years, so the books, even the really old ones about it, still hold true. I hope this video helped you out. Thank you for watching. Don't know when the next one about audio is going to happen, but that might happen with your suggestions. So if there's any other topics that you would like me to do a deep dive on, please let me know in the comments. Thank you for watching.